There are moments in history that never truly leave us, memories carved deep into the soul, where the weight of courage and the silence of sacrifice still echo through time. Bastogne, December 1944. The cold wind bit through the Ardennes, carrying with it more than snow and frost. It carried the heavy breath of those holding the line when all hope seemed lost. Winston Churchill stepped down from the back of a military truck, not as a leader behind a desk, but as a witness to something no words could fully describe. Among the ruins of that battered village stood a woman unlike any he had met, Captain Eleanor Morgan of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Tall, composed, and carrying a storm within her eyes. She wasn't there to speak of victory or strategy. She was there to hold broken men together, not just their wounds, but what they carried inside. In that frozen silence, something passed between them. A quiet understanding, a shared burden. And in that moment, Churchill understood that some of the bravest souls never held a rifle, but they still stood on the front line, unshaken. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the tent, but inside, the warmth of a small fire brought a fragile sense of peace. It was late, and most of the men had already fallen asleep, their faces softening under the faint orange glow, their thoughts drifting far from the front lines. But not hers. Captain Eleanor Morgan sat quietly near the fire, her hands wrapped around a dented tin cup of tea that had long gone cold. Churchill, seated across from her, could sense something unspoken. In war, silence often said more than words, and he had learned to listen with his eyes as much as with his ears. She hadn't shared much since they met, calm, composed, professional. But that night, perhaps softened by exhaustion or trust, her voice finally broke through the quiet. "I used to write to someone," she began, staring into the flames, "back in Boston. His name was William Prescott, an army engineer." Churchill listened closely, saying nothing. "We exchanged letters for over a year. He made it all sound so hopeful, as if I belonged somewhere finally. But when we met, he looked at me like I was a stranger who had stolen someone else's place." Her voice tightened, and her eyes didn't leave the fire. "He said I was too tall, said I didn't match what he imagined. Then he put me on a train and sent me home, like I was some misdelivered parcel." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet ache, the kind that lingers long after the wound has closed. Churchill didn't interrupt. He simply reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a worn, creased letter. The paper had been read many times, its edges softened by time and care. "This arrived a few weeks ago," he said gently, handing it to her. Eleanor took it hesitantly, unsure. It was from a young Canadian soldier, a corporal who'd been injured near the border. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. He spoke of pain, fear, and a moment in the medical tent when someone had held his hand, looked him in the eye, and told him he was going to make it, even when he no longer believed it himself. He had kept her name. At the bottom, in a faded scrawl, "Thank you. Captain Morgan, you didn't just save my leg, you gave me the will to stand again." She folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling just a little. "Sometimes," Churchill said, his voice low, "people lose the chance to see what's truly in front of them. But here, in this madness, truth finds a way to reveal itself." Eleanor didn't reply, but something in her expression softened, not entirely healed, but no longer burdened by the same weight. Outside, the war continued to rumble in the distance. But for a few quiet moments, under the faint flicker of firelight, two people, one carrying the weight of a nation, the other the burden of forgotten kindness, shared a silence that spoke of something deeper than victory or loss. In war, It wasn't just battles that shaped people. It was moments like this. Moments that carved themselves into memory. Moments that reminded even the hardest souls why they kept going. The storm outside never truly stopped. Shells cracked in the distance, shaking the frozen earth beneath Bastogne, while muffled cries echoed from deeper within the shelter. The medical post was dim, lit by flickering lanterns and held together by sandbags, hope, and the steady hands of those who refused to leave the wounded behind. Captain Eleanor Morgan moved between the makeshift cots with practiced calm, but inside, the weight of it all pressed heavy. That's when she saw him. Gabriel Blackwood. He was barely conscious when they carried him in. A tall, broad-shouldered figure from the French Mountain Command, his uniform torn and soaked from the retreat through Foy. His face was bruised, his knee wrapped hastily in bloodied cloth, his breath shallow. Yet, as she approached, his eyes flickered open, and the ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I knew it," he murmured, voice weak, but laced with something familiar. "Still too tall for me." For the first time since Eleanor had arrived in Bastogne, a smile found its way to her face. Small, but real. The kind that broke through the weight of everything surrounding them. Pain, frost, uncertainty, and reminded them both that they were still human. They had met once before, months earlier during a chaotic evacuation in Sicily. A brief moment in a war full of blurs. But it had stayed with them, both of them. And now, fate had crossed their paths again, under far crueler skies. From the doorway, Churchill stood watching. He'd been moving quietly through the camp, observing, listening, gathering more than just strategic reports. He studied the faces, the connections, the fragile threads holding people together. And in that moment, he understood something deeper than orders and maps. These fleeting bonds, forged under fire, remembered even through injury, were the very soul of the war. Churchill didn't interrupt. He simply nodded to himself and turned back into the night, his breath turning to mist as he disappeared into the cold. But in his mind, he carried the image, a wounded soldier who still found humor in pain, and a nurse who had almost forgotten how to smile. Both of them, unknowingly, keeping each other from falling apart. As the siege tightened and the sounds of war grew closer, Churchill made a quiet but firm decision. A half-destroyed house at the edge of Bastogne, windows shattered, roof caved in, but walls still standing, would become a new refuge. It was no longer a home, not in the way it once had been. But perhaps for a few days, it could shelter those who had nothing else. Inside, the team worked fast. Cots were carried in, blankets laid across cracked floorboards, and lanterns hung from nails hammered into broken beams. Among the volunteers was Martha Webb, a Belgian woman with sharp eyes and hands that never slowed. She had refused to flee. Instead, she brought what little she had, a kettle, a stubborn will, and the quiet authority of someone who had lost too much to care about rank. She offered the back room for the worst cases. Eleanor placed Gabriel Blackwood there. The days that followed unfolded slowly, wrapped in cold mornings, quiet nights, and the constant hum of war outside the walls. Gabriel's wounds began to heal, not quickly, but enough to sit upright, enough to speak. He rarely spoke of the war. Instead, he quoted lines from Victor Hugo, his voice soft but steady, carrying verses about storms, strength, and hope carved from despair. Eleanor listened as she worked, stitching torn sleeves, replacing bandages, clearing away the mess that suffering always leaves behind. She said little, but her silence wasn't cold. It was the kind of silence that holds attention, the kind that invites trust. And something began to shift. They spoke more with glances than with words. They didn't need to explain where they had come from or what they had seen. The war had already written those answers on their faces. Outside, Churchill passed by the shattered window more than once. He moved quietly. Coat buttoned to the neck, boots dusted in frost. He never interrupted, he only watched. And in the margin of his weathered notebook, he scribbled a single line. "It is strange how, even among the ruins of war, some hearts still manage to find shelter in one another." The days remained harsh. The sound of artillery never fully faded. But inside that broken house, something gentle began to grow. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily. And in times like those, that was more than enough. The fragile calm that had settled over the makeshift infirmary shattered with the sound of boots crunching through snow. Lieutenant William Prescott had arrived in Bastogne. He claimed it was a routine inspection of supply lines, but his presence felt colder than the air outside. His uniform was pristine, untouched by mud or blood, and his posture rigid, not from discipline, but from pride. As he stepped into the converted house, his eyes scanned the room until they landed on Eleanor. She was seated beside Gabriel, gently adjusting a splint on his leg. The connection between them was obvious, not loud, but real. Prescott's expression darkened. "Well," he said, his voice thick with contempt, "still trying to prove you belong, Captain?" The insult didn't land gently. It came with the sharpness of old wounds reopened. Eleanor stood slowly, her gaze unwavering. Gabriel stirred behind her, trying to rise, but she placed a steady hand on his chest. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You've never understood strength, Prescott," she said softly. "You only ever chased control." The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. From the doorway, Churchill had heard every word. He stepped inside, his presence undeniable, his voice calm, but carved with steel. "In times of war, Mr. Prescott," he said, "masks tend to fall quickly, and some of the faces we find beneath them are disappointing." Prescott held his stance, lips tight, face flushed with something between shame and anger, but he said nothing. He gave a stiff nod, turned on his heel, and walked out without another word. Silence followed, heavy but not bitter. Eleanor exhaled slowly, then looked down at Gabriel, who gave her a quiet nod, a silent thanks, not just for defending him, but for standing tall in the face of the man who once tried to make her small. Churchill remained for a moment, watching the two of them. Then he stepped back into the cold, the door creaking shut behind him, as if sealing away a moment that would never be forgotten. That night, the sky tore open without warning. A sudden wave of artillery rained down over Bastogne, shaking the ground and swallowing what little peace remained. The sound was deafening, a thunder of iron and fire. One of the shells struck the old house that served as the infirmary. The blast split the roof and sent wooden beams crashing down. Inside, chaos erupted. Dust filled the air. Shouts and groans echoed through the crumbling walls. Gabriel was caught beneath the wreckage, his leg pinned by a collapsed beam. The weight pressed against his chest, stealing his breath. He cried out not from fear, but from pain so sharp it forced his eyes shut. Eleanor stumbled through the smoke and rubble, blood streaking down her forearms from cuts she hadn't even noticed. Her heart raced, but her hands didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees and began to dig, lifting broken planks and shattered boards with everything she had. One by one, the beams gave way. She reached Gabriel and wrapped her arms under his shoulders, dragging him free as the roof continued to groan above them. Outside, Churchill was already moving. He had been at the edge of town when the shelling began and ran straight toward the smoke. He found a nearby school, long abandoned and mostly in ruins. The basement was intact, cold and dark, but safe. He led the others there, helping to carry the wounded as more shells lit up the night. In that narrow basement, among the groans and flickering lanterns, Eleanor worked by feel and memory. She had no clean tools, no light, but a trembling flame and no time. Gabriel's chest was torn, not fatal, but deep enough to leave her hands soaked in red as she pressed cloth against the wound. She trembled, not from fear, but from everything that had nearly been lost. Gabriel's breathing slowed. He opened his eyes, found her face through the haze, and reached for her hand. "You saved me. Again," he whispered. She didn't answer. Her mouth couldn't form the words, but her eyes, filled with exhaustion, fury, relief, and something too tender to name, said everything. Churchill stood just a few feet away, watching in silence. His shoulders were hunched from the weight of the night, but his gaze remained sharp. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak. Some moments deserved only silence. Above them, the shelling faded. The night held its breath, and in the flicker of that broken world, two souls, torn and mended by war, held on to something real, something that refused to fall, even as the walls around them did. The days that followed brought a bitter cold and something else. Whispers. Around campfires and behind stacked crates, murmurs began to spread. Some soldiers, worn down by fear and boredom, found comfort in gossip. They spoke of Captain Eleanor Morgan's visits to Gabriel Blackwood's bedside, not with concern, but with suspicion. Words twisted in the dark, and where respect should have lived, judgment crept in. It was petty, but poison often starts in small doses. Eleanor noticed the glances, the sudden hush when she passed. The weight of unspoken doubts pressed on her shoulders more heavily than any medical pack she'd carried. Churchill heard the rumors. He didn't confront them with anger. He chose something stronger. On a grey morning, he gathered the men in Bastogne's battered square. The cold wind carried his voice as he stepped forward, coat buttoned tight, hands behind his back, eyes sharp with resolve. "I've heard the whispers," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I've heard the doubts cast like stones behind closed doors, but let me remind you—" He paused, letting the silence settle over them. "In times like these, honor is not measured by the distance between two beds. It is measured by the courage to face fear and the strength to carry others through it. Captain Morgan has done both, and more, and those who speak against her would do well to kneel before the weight she's carried in silence." No one replied. No one dared. The crowd slowly dispersed, heads bowed, eyes thoughtful. The whispers died before the day was done. Later, Eleanor walked through the streets of Bastogne. The same streets where shadows once followed her now felt open. She no longer needed to avoid the gaze of others. Her chin lifted naturally, her steps steady. She didn't ask for a defense, but she had earned one. And in Churchill's words, the truth had found its place, loud enough to silence even the quietest cruelty. As the harshest stretch of winter tightened its grip on Bastogne, the news arrived like a frostbite to the heart. The enemy was preparing a new push, a direct assault through the forest trails, cutting straight through the fragile defensive line where Gabriel once stood. The terrain was brutal, the cold unforgiving, and the risk unbearable. When word of the operation reached the makeshift infirmary, Gabriel sat upright, pain etched deep in his eyes. His wounds had not yet healed, but his instinct to return, to stand with the men he had once led, burned brighter than reason. "I know that terrain," he said quietly, his voice dry and firm. "They'll need someone who does." Churchill was there, standing near the foot of his cot. The old leader said nothing at first. He studied Gabriel's face, saw the determination, the pride, and the weariness beneath it. Then he shook his head. "No," Churchill said simply. "This war will not be won by martyrs. It will be won by those who understand when to step back and live to lead another day." Gabriel clenched his fists, struggling with the weight of those words. The silence was tense, thick with everything unspoken. That's when Eleanor stepped forward. She knelt beside the cot, placing her hand gently on his arm. "If you go now," she said softly, "and you don't return, it won't be heroism. It will be cruelty, not to your country, but to the life you still have waiting, to those who need you after the war." Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes did, not with fear but with love, the quiet, powerful kind that doesn't beg or plead, but reminds someone of what's worth staying for. Gabriel looked from her to Churchill. The fire in his chest didn't fade, but it shifted. For the first time in his life, he chose not to fight. He chose to live. He nodded. Churchill gave a brief nod in return, a rare softness touching his stern expression. "History remembers the ones who stood their ground," he said, "but it honors those who knew when to stand down." The forest would see another battle, but this time Gabriel would not be among the fallen. He had made a different kind of choice, one that required more strength than any assault ever could. A few days later, the tide began to shift. The enemy's advance through the frozen woods was halted. The line held. Bastogne, battered, broken, and buried in snow, had not fallen. The sacrifice of those who remained, who endured, the longest nights and the sharpest hunger had made the difference. It wasn't a victory marked by parades or loud celebration. It was quieter than that, but no less real. Churchill departed Bastogne soon after. Duty called him back to London, back to strategy rooms and radios that buzzed with the weight of nations. But before he left, he placed a small envelope inside Eleanor's battered travel case, tucked beneath spare bandages and a folded scarf. She found it 2 mornings later, as she prepared fresh dressings for Gabriel. The fire in the room crackled softly, and outside, the snow had begun to melt just slightly under the pale winter sun. She sat beside Gabriel, now stronger, his color returning, his voice no longer just a whisper. Together, they read the letter in silence. "You have proven that some women were not born to take up less space. They were born to hold men upright, even when the ground beneath them shakes. W. Eleanor closed the letter slowly, her hands trembling just enough for Gabriel to notice. He reached for her hand, not as a patient, not as someone who owed her his life, but as a man who understood what she had carried through it all. The war wasn't over. There were still miles to march, still headlines to write, still sorrow waiting on distant roads. But in that quiet moment, something else had begun, something gentle, something strong. It didn't need grand declarations or medals. It lived in silence, in shared glances, in letters left behind, and in the space between 2 hearts that, against all odds, had found each other among the ruins. As the years passed and the guns finally fell silent, time did what war never could. It offered space to breathe again. London, 1945. The streets were filled with flags, music, and voices that had once whispered in fear, now singing in relief. The war was over. But for those who had lived it, carried it, and survived its storms, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Eleanor and Gabriel were assigned to London during the post-war rebuilding. Together they worked in a newly restored military hospital, not as survivors, but as those who could now help rebuild what had been broken. Their bond, forged in the deepest frost of Bastogne, never faded. It grew in the quiet moments, the shared routines, the mornings that didn't begin with explosions, but with coffee and peace. When the day of the victory parade arrived, they marched not at the front nor at the back, but side by side, steady, proud, changed. Eleanor wore her uniform with the same quiet strength that had once pulled a man from the rubble. Her shoulders, once burdened by doubt and shame, now carried the weight of something greater. dignity earned in silence. Churchill saw them from a distance before they reached the reviewing stand. His face, lined from years of burden, softened when he recognized them. He stepped forward, no fanfare, no crowd behind him, just a man welcoming two others home. "It wasn't a love made for cinema," he said with a rare smile. "It was a love born in the trenches, and those are the ones that last." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She took his hand and held it firmly, as if closing a chapter with gratitude rather than sorrow. She had once left with her head down, dismissed by a man who could not see her worth. Now she returned taller than ever, not just in stature, but in spirit. Too tall for some, perhaps, but finally tall enough to stand within the full height of her own story. Churchill watched her walk away, her silhouette strong against the fading light. In his breast pocket, he carried a worn notebook, the same one that had followed him through bunkers and snow. That night, alone in his study, he opened it to the last page and wrote, "Some victories are not shouted. They are lived in quiet courage, in lasting love, and in the hands that never let go when the world was falling apart." He closed the book and looked out the window as the city slowly turned toward peace. The war had ended, but the stories, the ones that truly mattered, were just beginning to be told. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Until the next memory, we'll be waiting.